Can you believe at one point the US military thought that the 30-06 might just be too powerful? And they thought it was a bit excessive for the new self-loading service rifle that they wanted to build in 1921, which is known today as the M1 Garand, and that was supposed to replace the Springfield 1903. But way before M1 was even a thing, this project almost immediately ran into a problem. And it's the same type of problem that still exists today. And it's a pattern that repeats itself throughout military small arms history, where people in charge tend to spend a bunch of money building something first, then they pivot 180 to prioritize logistics, cost, and politics, and then they spend decades engineering around the consequences instead of undoing the decision. So the Army's conclusion was to increase each soldier's volume of fire capability, but the recoil has to be dialed back, but also not at the expense of losing range.
In fact, one man firing a Garand can do nearly as much damage as three men using the old-type Springfield rifle with its hand-operated bolt.
And that doctrine remained true well into the Vietnam War and beyond. In a way, they held on to the 30-06 for a long time, thinking maybe they can build a higher capacity sub-ish, yet a lighter than 10-pound rifle. But meanwhile, they were okay to adopt a new caliber. So long story short, multiple designs were rejected because the 30-06 would just beat them up, and they wouldn't be good to go on the battlefield. At this point, the War Department was like, well then, it's either a heavier rifle or a smaller caliber. So then the Army's Ordnance Department spent a bunch of money and allocated top talents to develop a new caliber. And they eventually narrowed down on a bullet design that weighed 125 grain, with a muzzle velocity of 2,700 feet per second, and the performance were actually better than the 30-06 in some medium to long-range terminal ballistics testing. That cartridge became known as the 276 Pedersen. It has less recoil, smaller diameter, and it won't overheat. And that way, whatever small rifle designs the War Department end up choosing, it would work well. At the time, the military liked the idea of switching to a new caliber that would do well in a semi-auto platform. But they didn't even have a rifle to use it with. So long story short, they had to make a new rifle. And that came down to the Pedersen T1, the Germany Luger-style loading mechanism-looking rifle, chambered in 276, competing with John Garand's 276 rifle design. And the military actually leaned more towards John Garand's design. And the semi-automatic rifle board actually ran some successful trials for years and showed some confidence in it, and they recommended it for adoption in 1932.
When the cartridge is nearly seated, the bolt begins to lock.
But then the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, killed it completely. He basically said, "To make this change will introduce an element of chaos, confusion, and uncertainty which, magnified under war conditions, would more than counteract the beneficial effect of any semi-automatic rifle." The recommendations seem to have been somewhat influenced by the technical perfection of the smaller caliber. Too little attention has been paid to the other important features involved. So MacArthur looked at the massive surplus of 30-06 ammunition left over from World War I, saw that the country was in the middle of the Great Depression, and decided the military budget couldn't justify introducing a new caliber when millions of rounds were already sitting in warehouses. So instead, MacArthur forced the Garand to use the high-pressure 30-06, which meant American soldiers in World War II and Korea carried a heavier rifle with more recoil and less ammunition capacity than was technically possible. So the decision wasn't based on terminal performance or any sort of reliability-related testing. It was based on accountants looking at warehouse inventory. And just like that, MacArthur's decision at this point in history has set a pattern that would repeat for decades.
Whether you're in the field or in the shop, if you know your weapon thoroughly, you can keep it firing.
So after the war, the British saw a second chance to adopt an optimized intermediate cartridge. So they developed the 280 British that fired a 7mm bullet designed to split the difference between the killing power of a full-size rifle round and the controllability of a submachine gun. The 280 British was born from British observations of the German STG-44, and its 792 by 33mm Kurz has way lower recoil, and it was more effective in modern mobile warfare than traditional long-range rifle rounds. The British thought the 280 struck the perfect balance, and they built the EM2 bullpup rifle around it. But the United States rejected the concept entirely. They were still in love with the performance of the 30-06, and they went on to develop the T-65 cartridge, a similar bullet but shorter, which became what we all know as the NATO 7.62x51, aka the 308. So the dispute came down to the fact that the US claimed the 280 British was underpowered for long-range engagements, while the British argued the American 7.62 kicked too hard to control during automatic fire from a shoulder-fired rifle. But regardless what the Americans thought, the EM2 was still adopted by the British military in 1951 anyway. The technical dispute became irrelevant when Winston Churchill returned as Prime Minister in late 1951. Faced with a fractured NATO alliance, and he decided to sacrifice the 280 British for the sake of diplomatic harmony with the Americans. So Churchill personally intervened to overturn the adoption of the EM2 and the 280 British. He chose NATO standardization over anything else. However, the cost influence here was brutal, because 5 EM2 rifles cost the same as 6 FAL rifles, and Churchill wanted to maintain a unified front against the Soviet Union more than he wanted to equip his infantry with the best possible weapon. And that decision validated the original British position at the cost of billions in developmental waste and logistical confusion across the entire NATO alliance. At the end, the 280 British joined the Pedersen in the graveyard of superior cartridges killed by non-technical decisions. But at least one of them died to save money. The other was spent on the wrong solution. So by the mid-1950s, the consequences of these decisions were becoming clear. Data from World War II and Korea showed most firefights happened at short ranges, most shots missed, and recoil-heavy rifles made fast, accurate follow-up shots almost impossible for the military at this point. Instead of asking how powerful a bullet should be, the Army started asking how likely a soldier was to hit anything at all. But rather than revisit the intermediate cartridge concept they'd already rejected twice, they chose mad science. And this led to Project Salvo in November 1952. The goal was to increase lethality by firing multiple projectiles with a single trigger pull, and eventually it evolved into the Special Purpose Individual Weapon Program, the SPIW. The Army's requirements for the SPIW were a bit weird in today's standard, and it was just a bit too much, even just looking at the designs companies have submitted. Because they wanted a rifle that weighed less than 10 pounds, carried 60 rounds of ammunition, and included a semi-automatic 40mm grenade launcher, all in one package. The ammunition for the SPIW was supposed to consist of tiny steel darts called flechettes that could travel at hypervelocities and penetrate helmets at 500 yards. The bureaucratic environment surrounding the program was incredibly toxic because the program was managed with such deep secrecy and institutional pride that when it eventually failed, officials tried to bury the records to avoid embarrassment. It was such an embarrassing flop that had been buried so deeply that you would have a hard time finding it even online these days. The flechettes were wildly inaccurate, with dispersion so great that they missed targets even at close range, and testing showed that the weapons could only achieve 52% hits in a 30-inch circle at 40 yards, which was worse than existing rifles. The weapons also suffered from rapid heating that led to frequent cartridge cook-offs, and because the flechettes were so light, they didn't produce enough recoil to operate a standard rifle action. And then, a company named Aircraft Armaments Incorporated had to develop a piston primer system for their .22 Aero cartridge, where the primer would blow backward upon firing to manually cycle the bolt. And this complex mechanical sequence added hundreds of potential failure points to every single rifle. By this point, the program has spent millions of American taxpayer dollars over more than a decade and several of the most productive years of the American small arms community, but it produced absolutely no usable weapon. The failure of the SPIW program contributed directly to the decline and eventual closure of the historic Springfield Armory in 1968. And of the 480 employees at the Armory, and only fewer than 20 people agreed to transfer when the facility shut down, because the rest quit in the face of what they saw as a failed and mismanaged effort to save an orphaned project. The Spew project has proved that whoever in charge were faced with evidence that a caliber was wrong for its role. The military would rather spend a decade on flechette experiments than admit the 280 British advocates had been right all along. While flechettes failed in the labs, the Army tried a more conservative approach that pretty much followed the same institutional pathology, and that was the M198 duplex. This design is a bit insane and almost looks stupid in today's engineering standard, which the case is loaded with 2 bullets into a standard 7.62 by 51mm NATO casing instead of 1. The M198 could fire 2 84-grain slugs at approximately 2750 feet per second, and proponents within the Operations Research Office labeled it a low-cost, low-risk, high-payoff innovation because it required absolutely no modification to the existing M14 rifle. And the logic was that they would, rather than adopt a different cartridge, they'd engineer the existing cartridge to do what it couldn't. So the entire idea was that the second bullet would naturally disperse slightly from the first one, and the pattern of it supposed to increase the chance of it hitting a target, and the cartridge actually got type classified for use, which meant it was officially a standard issue item. So then they okayed the idea and sent the design to the Frankfurt Arsenal for some extensive testing. But in 1965, the Army determined that it offered no substantial combat advantage over standard single-bullet ball ammunition. The obvious reason was that the dispersion turned out to be difficult to predict in actual field conditions, and the reduction in individual bullet weight meant that long-range lethality and penetration were both compromised compared to standard 7.62. Some limited quantities got issued to sniper teams in Vietnam, who would switch to duplex rounds for suppressive fire if they got caught in a close-range firefight. But the M198 idea never went into mass production. So, the M198 stood as proof that the Army would rather jam-pack 2 bullets that won't even seat properly in the shell casing than admit the caliber itself was the problem to the Brits. It's literally the same problem that killed the Pedersen and the 280 British. So, in hindsight, the bureaucratic promise of high payoff basically proved, literally, nothing. And because the Army was trying to fix the wrong variable in the equation, and instead of adopting a better cartridge design from the ground up, they kept trying to make 7.62 NATO work in roles it was never suited for. By the 1970s, the military had finally adopted the 5.56mm M16. At this point, intermediate cartridge concept the British had initially came up with 2 decades earlier was validated in combat. Now, the military thinks the small round lacked the range and power required for a belt-fed light machine gun. So the Squad Automatic Weapon Program developed the 6mm SAW cartridge that fired a heavier bullet at higher velocity than the 5.56, while being much lighter than the 7.62. Between 1972 and 1976, this 6mm round got tested extensively and was found to be an excellent compromise because it offered significantly better long-range performance than 5.56 NATO while keeping ammunition weight reasonable for soldiers in the field. The round could deliver effective fire at ranges where 5.56 started to lose energy, and it didn't require the heavy ammunition loads that came with belt-fed 7.62 weapons. But by 1976, the Army had lost interest in the 6mm caliber and shifted focus back to 5.56 solely for the sake of logistical commonality with the M16 rifle. In order to ensure the rejection of alternative designs, the Army engaged in what can only be described as bureaucratic sabotage during the testing of candidate weapons like the H and K23A1. During the 5.56 machine gun trials, the Army replaced the standard M193 and 196 ammunition with experimental XM287 and 288 rounds that had thinner brass walls, which led to catastrophic failures in the HK rifles. And these reliability issues then got used by the Army to justify rejecting the weapons. The decision to abandon the 6mm SAW was driven entirely by fear of the replacement cost, and in 1979, the estimated cost to replace the military's small arms with a new 6mm system was $360 million. At this point in history, the irony was that if the military had just adopted the 280 British in 1951 and actually sit down and thought it through without getting their egos attached, they'd have already had an intermediate cartridge system and wouldn't need to replace anything. Instead, the cost of the wrong decision and national pride became the justification for another wrong decision that wasted a bunch of money. When the military faced with this figure, The Army chose the interoperability of the 5.56, even though it meant soldiers would be equipped with a weapon that was ballistically inferior to the intermediate 6mm alternative they'd just finished proving worked better. The 6mm saw remains one of the greatest what-if scenarios in American ballistics history. It's another failed project, all due to an institutional pattern that had been killing could-be some good cartridges, and putting procurement politics above everything. The pattern wasn't uniquely American. In Germany, H&K also spent nearly 2 decades proving that institutional dysfunction was pretty much worldwide. What the Germans were doing was similar of being a mad science project too, and that was the H&K G11 that sought to leapfrog everything else entirely by using 473 by 33mm caseless ammunition, and that it only has a solid block of propellant with no brass case to eject. So the caseless round allowed for a rifle with a simplified clockwork action that could fire at a phenomenal 2,100 rounds per minute in a 3-round burst. And the lack of an ejection cycle meant the weapon could deliver all 3 rounds before the shooter felt any recoil. By 1990, after 20 years of development and the expenditure of 84.1 million Deutschmarks in German taxpayer funds, the G11 was actually a technical success that had been certified for use by the Bundeswehr, and a contract for 300,000 units worth 2.7 billion Deutschmarks was planned for the period up to 2002. But the program got immediately derailed by the most significant geopolitical shift of the century, which was the reunification of Germany in 1990. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the German military budget got slashed to fund the integration of East Germany, and the reunification left the German government with a surplus of hundreds of thousands of Kalashnikov rifles from the East German military. In the face of this sudden surplus and the signing of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which mandated the destruction of excess weaponry, the expensive and complex G11 became a political liability that couldn't be justified. So later in January 1992, the Federal Audit Office recommended against the procurement of the G11, which led Defense Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg to officially strike it from the procurement list. The project finally got canceled in 1993, with some officials citing that it lacked NATO standardization because the gun couldn't work with NATO 5.56. And then H&K got left with a staggering debt of 180 million Deutschmarks from the development process, and the German military eventually opted for the much cheaper and more conventional G36 rifle instead. The G11 produced roughly 1,000 prototypes, and when you compare the economics, 5 G11 rifles cost the same as 6 conventional rifles. The economics mirrored the British EM2 exactly. So roughly 38 years later, the same cost ratio killed the same kind of innovation. The caseless ammunition concept itself was sound from a technical standpoint, but the geopolitical reality of German reunification and NATO standardization requirements killed a program that had already spent 2 decades proving the technology could work in combat conditions. The G11 had actually done everything right if you just look at its 2 decades of engineering iteration with some technical certification. It got Bundeswehr approval, but at the end, none of it mattered. Today, as the US took the lead, developing the 6.8 intermediate cartridges in programs like the Next Generation Squad Weapon, and cared less of what the NATO countries actually think, and they're reinventing the wheel again. The engineering process is so much more advanced than before, and as long as engineers follow the laws of physics, everything works, and nothing changes. What hasn't changed is going through the filter like procurement bureaucracies that would rather spend decades on failed experiments and feed the military-industrial complex than admit a previous decision was wrong. And the pattern hasn't changed in 100 years. And neither has the cost.